Let's talk about Wuthering Heights. 2026 has just begun, and it seems like we already have a candidate for the most controversial movie of the year. When Emerald Fennell's adaptation of Wuthering Heights was announced back in 2024, I already knew it was going to be a bit of a shit show. Not only because people tend to be more critical of adaptations of literary classics, but because Fennell herself is a love her or hate her type of director. The film industry has been fascinated by Emily Bronte's 1847 novel for the better part of a century, and Emerald Fennell's take on the story is just one of many. So why is it causing such a fuss? Today I'll be discussing what I did and didn't like about the 2026 version of Wuthering Heights, including the changes to the source material, Emerald Fennell's steamy direction, and the anachronistic costume choices. Obviously, this is just my opinion, and what might not have worked for me might have worked for you. That doesn't mean that either one of us is right or wrong. Also, there will be spoilers for the book and the movie. Don't say that I didn't warn you. Now let's get into it. The film begins with a young Catherine Earnshaw watching a public hanging alongside her servant/companion, Nellie Dean. Upon their return home to Wuthering Heights, the Earnshaw's gloomy farmhouse, we meet the rest of the servants and Catherine's father, who is an abusive drunk. One day he comes home with an orphan boy who Catherine names Heathcliff, and the two become playmates, with Catherine treating him as a sort of pet, bossing him around and calling him names. To protect Catherine, Heathcliff bears the brunt of Mr. Earnshaw's abuse, which only gets worse as the years pass, and the man's gambling and alcoholism throws the estate into poverty. As adults, Catherine and Heathcliff have an emotional and physical attraction to each other, but neither acts on their feelings, although they do come awfully close. One day, the wealthy Lintons move in next door, and Catherine decides to court the man of the house, Edgar, in a desperate attempt to improve her financial situation. She accepts Edgar's marriage proposal in spite of her love for Heathcliff, and heartbroken, he runs away. Catherine and Nellie move in with the Lintons, and while her life appears idyllic, Catherine is unable to rid herself of thoughts of Heathcliff. Years pass and Heathcliff finally returns, buying Wuthering Heights with his newfound wealth and making a point of tormenting Catherine with his constant presence. Edgar's ward, Isabella, becomes infatuated with Heathcliff, which causes a rift in her and Catherine's friendship. After years of over-drinking, Mr. Earnshaw finally dies, and in her grief, Catherine begins a sexual affair with Heathcliff, but it comes to an end after Nellie tells Edgar about it. When Heathcliff discovers that Catherine is pregnant with Edgar's child, he pursues Isabella out of spite. He warns her that he'll be cruel to her, but she accepts the terms, and the two marry and move to Wuthering Heights, where he begins abusing her physically, emotionally, and sexually. He has Isabella write Catherine love letters, but Nellie destroys them, and thinking that Heathcliff has truly abandoned her, Catherine falls into a depressive state, locking herself in her room and refusing to eat. She eventually has a miscarriage which leads to sepsis, and when it becomes clear that she doesn't have much longer to live, Nellie tells Heathcliff of her dire state. Heathcliff rushes to Catherine's side, but doesn't arrive in time, and while clutching Catherine's dead body, he begs her to haunt him and drive him mad. The end. For anyone unfamiliar with the novel, it takes place over 30-something years and follows two generations of characters. With so much going on, that makes it a pretty tough story to wrap up in under 2 hours. So like the vast majority of Wuthering Heights adaptations, the 2026 film ends with Catherine's death and ignores Heathcliff's abuse of their children. Now I understand why Emerald Fennell and the dozens of directors before her have gone in this direction, but it's caused a lot of misinterpretations about Wuthering Heights' message, which isn't just a tragic love story, but a cautionary tale of obsession and revenge. Catherine and Heathcliff are both incredibly damaged people who take their unhappiness out on themselves, each other, and everyone around them. Sure, you pity them because their initial circumstances are no fault of their own, but you're not exactly rooting for them to have a happily ever after either. Now that isn't to say that they're totally irredeemable, but I do think it's tough to sell something as the greatest love story ever told when the couple in question would be better off without each other. Most adaptations position Heathcliff as the more villainous of the two, but Catherine is no angel herself, desperately craving affection, being prone to fits of rage, and feeling entitled to Heathcliff's entire existence. According to Emerald Fennell, she first read Wuthering Heights when she was 14, and I think that shows in the final product, with the film taking a rather simple and juvenile approach to the novel's themes. In Fennell's eyes, Heathcliff isn't a madman with an unshakable grudge, but a hopeless romantic whose soulmate is always out of his reach. She's by no means the first to romanticize Heathcliff, but she goes further than most when it comes to softening his image. We don't see him exploit Hindley's alcoholism or kill Isabella's dog. They just focus on his yearning, but not how bitter and broken he is. Fennell just wants him to be a heartthrob, as evidenced by who she cast in the role. I think Jacob Elordi is an incredibly talented actor, but I just don't think he was the right choice for Heathcliff. Obviously, he's hot, which was Emerald Fennell's goal, but nothing else about him adds up to the character. I know that Elordi filmed Wuthering Heights shortly after wrapping on Guillermo del Toro's Frankenstein, and I feel like he was still possessed by the creature, because there are definitely a few moments where his Heathcliff comes across as so wounded and innocent that you forget that he's a terrible person. Most adaptations of Wuthering Heights have gone in a tall, dark, and handsome direction for Heathcliff, but said darkness only ever extends to his hair and eye color. These films rarely address the fact that the novel makes it pretty clear that he has a different racial background than the rest of the characters, which is a crucial aspect of the abuse directed towards him. He spends most of his childhood being treated as less than human because of his skin color, so it's no surprise that he becomes a vicious animal as an adult. Now, what people consider white nowadays is pretty different from the 1800s, and while people of African, Asian, and Romani descent were treated as inferior by Anglo-Saxons, so were the Irish and Italians.
What are you, Scandinavian?
Yeah, Swedish.
Swedish dogs? Your blood is tainted by generations of race mixing with Laplanders. You're basically Finns.
Emily Brontë was herself the daughter of an Irishman, and the entire Brontë family were staunch supporters of the abolitionist movement, and their awareness of racial injustices was present in all of their work, including Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff is found by Mr. Earnshaw on a trip to Liverpool, an area that controlled about 80% of the British slave trade. Mr. Earnshaw describes Heathcliff as having no owner, while Nellie suggests that he was kidnapped by wicked sailors and brought to England. I don't know about you, but that sounds an awful lot like the way someone would describe a slave. A lot of people have the same mindset as Emerald Fennell, however, and think that Heathcliff is just a white guy with slightly darker coloring, pointing at a line from the novel, quote, "his face as white as the wall behind him." But that's just a total misreading of the text, as the passage is directly referring to Heathcliff's shock, like when someone uses the phrase, "the color drained from his face." But of course, these same people will ignore the multiple other references to Heathcliff being non-white. He's called a dark-skinned gypsy and a little lascar, meaning a sailor from India. And Heathcliff himself literally says, "I wish I had light hair and fair skin." Now, back in the 1800s, anyone who wasn't the color of milk would have been considered dark-skinned. But to make those racial themes obvious to a modern audience, you need to lean into it. I don't think it would be a total reach to say that after over a dozen adaptations of the novel, it might be about time to cast a Heathcliff who actually does look different from everybody else, especially when there are other actors of color in the film. Heathcliff's racial background is also part of the reason why Catherine refuses to be with him. It isn't just his lack of fortune that's degrading to her. Heathcliff being perceived as non-white just adds to how taboo their romance would have been. Speaking of which, a popular theory is that Heathcliff is actually Mr. Earnshaw's bastard, hence why he's adopted in the first place. If true, that'd make him and Catherine siblings, making their weird relationship outright incestuous. In the film, they make it clear that Heathcliff is totally unrelated to the Earnshaws, but considering Emerald Fennell has a habit of adding uncomfortable themes to her films, I'm surprised that she didn't lean into the sibling implications. But I suppose her goal of having the audience root for Catherine and Heathcliff might not have worked out if people thought they were related. I know that a lot of people didn't like that Hindley, Catherine's older brother, was removed from the film. But I've got to be honest, it didn't make a huge difference to me, at least when it comes to this specific adaptation. It was very clear that Emerald Fennell was never going to adapt the second half of the novel, so all of the unfortunate business with Hindley and his son doesn't matter in the first place. I mean, that's why she has Catherine have a miscarriage at the end of the movie. She doesn't care about the second generation. Although having Mr. Earnshaw as the abuser gets rid of Catherine's initial envy towards Heathcliff, I think by having both of them be victims of the same violence, it makes their bond even stronger, instead of Catherine just standing by as Heathcliff is mistreated by Hindley. I also think that by having Catherine's father abuse her, it highlights how skewed her idea of love is, how she thinks that being mistreated is normal. I thought the younger version of Catherine, played by Charlotte Mellington, was one of the best I've seen on screen. She had all the character's anger and her adventurousness, but also a softness and sensitivity that helps you understand why Heathcliff attaches himself to her in the first place. Margot Robbie's Catherine, on the other hand, took some getting used to, but I think that's because she leaned into an aspect of the character that most people shy away from, her brattiness. Most of the time, Catherine is just this wild, free-spirited young lady who occasionally says the wrong thing. But in the 2026 film, they made her as petty and shallow as possible. When Margot Robbie was first announced to be playing Catherine, I was pretty concerned, as the actress is almost 20 years older than the character in question. I'm not saying she isn't pretty enough to play Catherine, but her face has definitely reached a level of maturity that isn't believable for a teenager. So I've got to credit Emerald Fennell for at least acknowledging that would be too large a suspension of disbelief, and actually aging all of the characters up. In the film, Mr. Earnshaw scolds Catherine for being unmarried past spinsterhood, which in the 1800s would have put her in her late 20s. From there, we see several years pass between the time she marries Edgar to when Heathcliff returns, so when she passes away, she's solidly in her 30s. Because every character is made older, it makes you realize just how long Catherine and Heathcliff have been pining after one another, and how their silly games have robbed them of their entire youth. Now, it's a small thing that's irked me in multiple adaptations, but I don't like how basically everyone in the film calls Catherine Cathy. It takes away from the connection she and Heathcliff have with one another, and how he sees himself as the only one deserving of her love. With Heathcliff no longer occupying the role of antagonist, Emerald Fennell had to find a different villain, Nellie, a decision I actually really liked. In the novel, Nellie is the reason for most of the miscommunications between Heathcliff and Catherine, but because she's also the narrator, she frequently positions herself as a mere bystander, sidestepping any blame. Most adaptations take her words at face value, making her an older motherly figure who just wants to protect the spirited Catherine from the wicked Heathcliff. In actuality, Nellie is only a few years older than Heathcliff and Catherine, and I really appreciate that the film took that into account. She also has hopes and desires, but because of her place in society, can't do anything about it. So just like Catherine and Heathcliff, she takes her unhappiness out on other people. Her vendetta against Heathcliff begins in their youth and is rooted in jealousy, having been replaced by him as Catherine's closest friend. Her resentment later redirects itself towards Catherine, with Nellie doing everything she can to stand in the way of her mistress's happiness. This eventually culminates in Nellie being directly responsible for Catherine's death. It's honestly one of the most gut-wrenching parts of the film. Hong Chow was absolutely fabulous in the role, but honestly, when is she not? Now, I feel a bit conflicted about Isabella, because on one hand, I think it turns her into a completely different character, but on the other, it gives her the most interesting evolution. In the book, Isabella's sheltered upbringing has led to her being rather spoiled and silly, but for the most part, she's still a good person. She initially sees Heathcliff as a sort of prince, but after marrying him, his abuse takes a toll, eventually culminating in her leaving him while pregnant. As a result, her character goes from having the least amount of agency to the most. In the film, Edgar infantilizes her, refusing to let her out of the house and treating her like a child well into adulthood. She's naive about the outside world, but also curious about it. Like most women of the era, she isn't able to express herself sexually, and these desires start to manifest themselves in unusual ways. First is her rabid obsession with Romeo and Juliet, then the suggestive book she gives to Catherine, her temper tantrum about watching a public hanging, and then destroying Catherine's doll out of jealousy. When they were younger, Heathcliff shielded Catherine from violence, whereas with Isabella, he's the one who inflicts it. But again, to prevent him from being an outright villain, Isabella consents to this arrangement even after receiving fair warning. Heathcliff treats her as a stand-in for Catherine, but only the most toxic parts of their relationship. I understand why some people have issues with this marital abuse being reframed as a kink, but I find it an interesting commentary on women's sexuality during the 1800s. Edgar sheltered Isabella to the point that she had no frame of reference for what is and isn't a healthy relationship, and as a way of rebelling against her father figure, she found herself the ultimate bad boy. I also think Alison Oliver was just an absolute scene stealer, managing to make Isabella's eccentricities unbelievably charming, even as they started moving in a darker direction. Like, she's weird, but you can't help but love her. I'd probably have to watch the movie again to break down the costumes in their entirety, but I don't hate them nearly as much as I thought I would. Costume designer Jacqueline Duran almost completely disregarded historical accuracy. but in doing so, she was able to prioritize their vision of the characters. Nellie's clothing takes notes from the early Victorian era and has the least amount of modern influences, highlighting how she doesn't have the fanciful or romantic inclinations that the other characters do. She almost exclusively wears black, which reads as more austere and also mirrors how she's a dark presence in Catherine's life. Isabella's clothing highlights her innocence, with poofy pastel dresses covered in frills. She not only looks younger than the rest of the characters, but as the film progresses, we can see how she's impacted by their wickedness, with her clothing becoming more and more ragged. Catherine almost exclusively wears shades of red, white, and black, highlighting the different facets of her personality, like her passion, sadness, and sexuality. While at Wuthering Heights, her clothing has more of a milkmaid look to it, allowing more movement and reflecting her simple farm girl background. When she moves in with the Lintons, she becomes more poised and restricted, as seen with her hair, which is suddenly done up in all kinds of bizarre styles, courtesy of Isabella. She wears a lot of modern fabrics and wacky makeup looks, showing how out of place she is in this world. She never looks comfortable, making it clear that deep down, she just wants to be the girl running around the moors with Heathcliff. However, with all that said, there are a few of her outfits that are too out there for me. The main one is her wedding nightgown, which looks like a reject from the Barbie movie. There are a ton of anachronisms throughout the film, in the costuming, the set design, the music, and it actually reminds me a bit of Poor Things, where we're meant to perceive this as a sort of dreamlike fantasy that isn't set in reality. But at least Poor Things committed to the weird, freaky sex stuff, whereas Wuthering Heights just teases it. There are a good amount of visuals that have aggressive imagery meant to allude to sex, like Heathcliff rubbing up on some eggs or Catherine sticking her finger in a fish's mouth. But there aren't that many actual sex scenes. In fact, you'd see more in an episode of Bridgerton nowadays. The most explicit part of the movie is at the very beginning, when a man is hanged and in his death throes gets an erection, which the crowd, including Catherine, can't help but leer at. Compared to Emerald Fennell's previous film, Saltburn, Wuthering Heights is pretty PG, which is actually surprising, since test audiences were reportedly shocked by how graphic the movie was, and I wonder if they actually toned down the horniness because of the initial negative response. Wuthering Heights was quite the controversial book upon its release, as seen in contemporary reviews of the novel. In an 1848 issue of Graham's Lady magazine, a critic wrote, quote, "How a human being could have attempted such a book as the present without committing suicide before he had finished a dozen chapters is a mystery. It is a compound of vulgar depravity and unnatural horrors." Now, if you've read Wuthering Heights, then you know that compared to the average smutty book of today, it's pretty tame. But it's important to take into account the time period it was written and the person it was written by. You simply couldn't publish a novel with graphic depictions of sex in the 19th century, especially if you were a woman. So instead, all of the intimacy has to be implied. And even still, the characters obey societal expectations, with Catherine and Heathcliff never actually consummating their relationship in spite of their feelings for one another. Emily Brontë was an unmarried woman, so it was unlikely that she even knew enough about sex to write about it in a descriptive way. With that in mind, perhaps it makes sense that Emerald Fennell held back on the raunchiness, although I do feel tricked by the film's marketing. Don't get me wrong, I enjoyed Promising Young Woman and Saltburn, but were they without faults? No. And I think that largely has to do with Fennell being a far stronger director than she is a writer, and that's painfully obvious with Wuthering Heights. The story plays out like fan fiction, but damn, does she know her way around a camera. Whether it's a funny moment or an unnerving one, every single shot in this film is absolutely breathtaking. And for that reason alone, I'm glad to have watched it on the big screen. I recently sat down and watched a dozen different adaptations of Wuthering Heights. The video's coming soon, I promise. And to be totally honest with you guys, even with all the issues I had with Emerald Fennell's version, it's by no means the worst. If you're a diehard fan of the book, will you like it? Probably not, but it isn't without any value. While it's unfortunate that the film decided to only focus on Catherine and Heathcliff's romance, I can respect that it tried to do something different with the source material, even if I don't necessarily agree with the interpretation. After all, it's better to swing and miss than just stand there. What did you think of Wuthering Heights? I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye!